We have on tap for this session a really wonderful program featuring a good friend and a distinguished scholar, Ilia Delio, who holds the Josephine C. Connolly Chair in Christian Theology at Villanova University. More on Professor Delio in just a moment. Let me first remind you of the procedure for tonight. Professor Delio will speak for 45, 50 minutes, something like that. And then I'll come back and introduce Professor John Haught of Georgetown University, and he will make a few comments. I no doubt pose a few questions, and I'm very eager to hear what he has to say. Professor Delio will then respond to what Jack has said, and the two will exchange ideas for a few moments. But as quickly as we can, we want to open the process to all of you, and so we invite you at any point along the way to use the question and answer function. Look down to the bottom of your screen, and you might need to hover your cursor down there a little bit and get that toolbar to open up, but you'll see Q&A. Open that and type your question in, and I will be able to read your questions and make sure it's a question, make sure it's not a dissertation or an alternate presentation, a question that then will be queued up for our speaker. As I said, our speaker is Professor Ilia Delio, who teaches at Villanova University. Her research and writing falls in the areas of systematic and constructive theology. And I have to tell you, she's been very busy churning out, carefully crafting books. I mean, the awards that have been either nominated or granted for these books is really pretty staggering. One that is coming, one that came out not too long ago, intriguing title. I suspect some of you will want to order this after our session tonight. Birth of a Dancing Star. Well, so far so good. Wait till you hear the subtitle. My Journey from Cradle Catholic to Cyborg Christian. Another book, Making All Things New, Catholicity, Cosmology, and Consciousness. Or an earlier book, 2014, The Unbearable Wholeness of Being, God, Evolution, and the Power of Love. Her latest book, actually not yet out in print, but coming soon, The Hours of the Universe. I almost wonder if there's a little echo of Teilhard in that title, The Hours of the Universe, Reflections on God, Science, and the Human Journey. Or the one that is most recently in print, and I happen to have it right here. It's entitled Re-Enchanting the Earth, Why AI, that is artificial intelligence, Needs Religion. Re-Enchanting the Earth. Highly commended. I did get a chance to read it over the summer. Well, it's a delight, Ilia, to welcome you. You're going to be speaking to us tonight on materialism, relational holism, and posthuman life. So welcome, please, Ilia, go ahead.
I really appreciate your kind introduction. And it's good to be with you in the IRAS community and extra IRAS participants this evening. Worldwide, it sounds. So that's great. My talk this evening, I think, is on a topic that should be something that we're engaged in, I think, in terms of discussion and thinking. And that is on the new materialisms and technology, relational holism. And maybe in order to enter into this discussion, I'd like to share my screen now. I do have a set of slides. Those of you who know me know I come always prepared with slides. So here we are, and I think I'll just go ahead and begin with the first one. And this term, the posthuman, which is something I really like to expound this evening. Now, if you have been keeping up with philosophy over the last 30 years, you'll realize it has gone through a number of significant shifts. And I think it is important to recognize the role philosophy plays in this dialogue of science and religion. Maybe shorthand speaking, there's no shift in religious thinking without a shift in philosophical thinking. So we have gone over the last few decades from phenomenology, which is from looking at the appearance of things, to structuralism, post-structuralism, and right now, sort of the hot topic, so to speak, is the new materialisms, which is a renewed emphasis on real things based on scientific discoveries. And I want to emphasize the role that science has played in this shift to the philosophy of the new materialisms. It's as if people actually woke up to the fact that matter is not a given. So beginning, I think I'm preaching to the choir on this point, that cosmology has radically changed in the early 20th century with the discovery of Einstein's theory of general relativity, and in a sense, the unfolding of space-time as a continuum. The very old, years of the universe, about 13.8 billion years, and the very expansive nature of the universe. And I am not a cosmologist, but from what I read, this whole story, this whole narrative of the Big Bang is currently a hot topic in those circles. And so, we have the big picture of the Big Bang, and then on the micro level, or the world of matter itself, the world of physics proper, is the world of energy. And of course, the radical discoveries of the early 20th century with regard, again, building off of Einstein's special relativity, that matter and energy are interconvertible, really caused some new thinking about materiality. And so we have, the realization that, thanks to Niels Bohr and others, that matter has a wave-particle dual property to it. In other words, it exists in these superimposed states, and the active observation through an apparatus determines what state a particle is in. And so this rise of quantum physics in the early 20th century really probed or evoked new understandings of consciousness or mind in relation to matter. Max Planck, the early physicist, said he regarded consciousness as fundamental to matter, that in a sense, everything begins with consciousness. And of course, this has given rise to a resurgence of panpsychism, or consciousness as not only the basis of materiality, but some go so far to say as matter itself. James Jean in 1950 wrote that mind no longer appears as an accident intruder into the realm of matter, but mind may be the creator and governor of the realm of matter. So according to Jean, the quantum phenomenon makes it possible to propose that the background of the universe is mind-like. Now, that's a very intriguing statement. And while my talk is not on a philosophy of mind this evening, it is really important how we consider the mind in relation to matter, especially when we talk of the new materialisms. Of course, added to our new universe story is the realization that biological life has emerged by way of evolution. And again, I think biology has done a lot since the time of Darwin to really expound mechanisms of evolution. It's not just a matter of natural selection or adaptation, but Today, we know that life emerges much more cooperatively, complexly. And so what we do know is that life does unfold. So matter is not a given, biological life is not a given. There is a dynamic process of life, however, at the heart of what we call nature itself. And so the human person, and here's really where I think our discussion tonight really will focus, and that is on what we mean by human personhood. We're certainly not a given, right? And even the Christian narrative of being created by God, while that's not dispelled in this narrative of science, it does need to be reconceived. What we do know is we emerge within the process of physical biological evolution, and we're constantly interacting with the world. So as Philip Hefner wrote beautifully a while ago, he said, personhood is achieved through our acting upon the physical, biological, and cultural materials that we have inherited to establish a center of identity that shapes those materials into an understanding of the self, an understanding of the self's relation to the world. So Hefner really evokes here a dynamic relationship between personhood and culture, personhood in evolution itself. Now, here's the interesting thing, it's a cute little image of, human evolution, so to speak. But we have here, in a sense, two phenomenon of the many that are going on. And one is the relationship of mind and matter. And the other is this rise of consciousness with increasing levels of biological complexity, something that Teilhard de Chardin himself noted. And, coupled with this evolutionary paradigm is the fact that in the mid 20th century, as we began to develop computer technology, and then we began to, in a sense, develop mechanical means to send humans into space, this notion of the cyborg was born. Now, a cyborg is technically a human person who has certain physiological processes either controlled or aided by mechanical or electronic devices. So a cyborg is short for a cybernetic organism, which is usually a hybrid. And that is the operative word here for cyborg, a hybrid of either biology and machine, or biology and animal, or biology and device. What is important here in terms of the cyborg, and here I mean cyborg as symbol of human, is that boundaries have only local meaning, only for the particular embodied subject. And so the cyborg, as Donna Haraway really brilliantly exposed in her 1985 essay, A Cyborg Manifesto, on science, technology, and socialist feminism in the late 20th century, the cyborg became the symbol, you might say, of biological life. Now, Haraway was writing as a social philosopher and as a feminist. And in her view, the cyborg refers to the assembling and disassembling of a type of collective and personal self that empowers us through the negotiation of culture and identity. In other words, what Haraway saw, and this was very insightful, is that the whole notion of gender, male, female, which was really tied to notions of biological essentialism, those notions were now being, in a sense, deconstructed or shattered by the notion of the cyborg. So she says the cyborg extends the idea of bodies beyond the Western origin myths. And here she's referring to the myth of Adam and Eve, which has, as we well know, given rise to structures of patriarchalism, domination, women as objects of power, etc. And so the cyborg is this hybridity of personhood that exists on the boundaries of human and machine. And therefore, boundaries are fluid. and playful in the enactment of identity. So what Haraway and others have noted is that the cyborg as a symbol really signals to us that we are moving, and maybe at this point have moved, beyond biological essentialism. The lines between the mechanical and the biological are now increasingly erased, even as we Zoom here together, so to speak. Today, the machine and the human form a hybrid cyborg that transcends the limits of biology, including gender. And I would include perhaps other aspects in this regard as well. But what we want to say here is that how we think of ourselves, that's what the cyborg does. It challenges us to think about ourselves in relation to the other in a new way. It challenges us to change the way we think about human gender and identity. There are no fixities here. And so in Haraway's view, the cyborg points to a reconstruction of gender. And here she almost has in mind Judith Butler's idea of a gender as performity. And this certainly in both Butler and Haraway, writing now over about 30 years ago or more, noted that we are moving away from this patriarchal essentialism towards what Haraway says, the utopian dream of the hope for a world without gender. So the hope as a creature in a post-gendered world with no origin story or fallenness or death is free, therefore, from defining the limits of nature. That last phrase is important for us. So cyborgs are really then the hybridity of personhood. And then the notion of the cyborg, in a sense, emerged around the same time that we were beginning to understand how systems work in terms of cybernetics, and how systems work as systems in terms of complex systems. And so these three C's, cyborgs, cybernetics, and complexity, are important for, in a sense, a renewal of understanding of personhood today. That looks like, oops, sorry about that. So what we're saying here is that we are redefining the human person. First, we're saying the human does not possess a stable form. Second, we're saying that the cyborg signals the end of a concept of a person as the autonomous individual possessing a self distinguished from the rest of nature by rational free will. And I want you to hold this second point in mind as we talk about transhumanism, posthumanism. Now, what Haraway noted, because of course she's writing about the cyborg in the face of a technological paradigm, not only space travel, but the rise of artificial intelligence. So she says, technology is not neutral. We are inside of what we make, and it is inside of us. We are living in a world of connections, and it matters which ones get made and unmade. That's an important saying. So I want to take a look at this point at artificial intelligence and the two philosophical trends that it has spawned. I think the first one we are probably familiar with, and that is transhumanism, which is the enhancement or perfection of the human by means of technology. Now, a lot of people, and I've seen this in the literature a lot of people see the super transhuman person as the posthuman. Like once we merge with technologies, we're in this posthuman situation. But posthumanism actually is a term that emerged with feminist scholars and has a different philosophical understanding from transhumanism. So I want to sort these two humanisms out. Whereas transhumanism is enhancement or perfection, posthumanism is a reconfiguration of the human in relation to culture and the environment, including technology. Now, transhumanism, of course, if you've read Nick Bostrom in The Transhuman and the Rise of Transhumanism, The Transhumanist Reader, Why I Want to Be a Posthuman, a lot of Bostrom's writings. as a movement, of course, transhumanism is a cultural philosophical movement that looks to enhance individuals, where we can use technology to live longer and happier and smarter with more control. Maybe even develop a technological type of democracy where humans can peacefully coexist. Well, these are certainly attractive aspirations in some ways. On the other hand,
bring in a few things from the book and also considerations of mine that I didn't.
I'm just gonna skip that one. What I want to say here is that transhumanism, on face value, seems very attractive, yet it's very problematic. Transhumanism, if I can just back up here, yeah, transhumanism seeks to enhance the human person as an individual, right? So in other words, if I can download my brain into a machine, perhaps I can resurrect myself in a machine. Perhaps I can, with the best of technology, overcome the barrier of death and really seek a digitized immortality, which is what Ray Kurzweil and Hans Moravec anticipate in the year 2045. That intelligent machines will provide humanity with personal immortality by mind transplant. So transhumanists look to the fact that the human person can be extended, we can be perfected or enhanced. We can, with technology, maybe take on new risks of doing new things, such as overcoming the death barrier. What we do have here, I think, with transhumanism is a prime example of biohacking. We can now break through the barriers of human personhood and we can alter those boundaries. Yet it does connote, I mean, I have to say, transhumanism brings to mind the subject of the Enlightenment. And one has, you might say, a reminiscence of Nietzsche's Overman, right? The Uberman, or the Superman. That, you know, we can become gods ourselves now with our technologies, and we can attain those very things that maybe religion promised but never really lived up to. So transhumanists, and this is why I want to point this out, has largely been articulated by male voices, not to the exclusion, however, since Vita and Natasha Moore, and there's some others in there, but for the most part, transhumanism is a male endeavor, whereas posthumanism has been largely, not exclusively, but largely articulated by women, by feminists. And so we have here two different trajectories of humanism in and through technology. Transhumanism, I think, really just continues the Enlightenment project. In other words, its teleology is defined by objective goals. It seeks to continue that aim of knowledge as power, super intelligence, for example. It prides itself on an autonomous will or a will to power. And the body does not seem, the material body, it does not seem overly important for the mind. Rather, the body is more of a support system for the mind. That will be distinct from posthumanism. Posthumanism looks at the use of technology in terms of the emergence of personhood. In other words, I don't become something other with technology. Rather, with that technology, my lines of communication or information are extended, so that I am becoming something more than what I am through technology, but not something other than what I am. So there's type of a reflexive epistemology in posthuman, insofar as now my extended mind and my extended body, perhaps, are also influenced by that to which I'm extended to. There is this notion of distributed cognition as well as extended embodiment. Here, although this may look like a transhumanist picture, posthumanism does not mean the end of humanity. It is a posthuman, however. Andy Clark, a well-known philosopher of mind in this area, says, well, we've always been post-human, right? If we take evolution seriously, we're always, in a sense, never at a level of stable humanity. But the post-human signals the end of a certain conception of the human as an autonomous being exercising an autonomous will through individual agency and choice. So as many post-human writers will note, the post-human signals the end of the liberal modern subject. And in fact, if we were to give a shorthand to the post-human, really what it's seeking to do is to be post-anthropocentric. And here, I would say the post-human does distinctly differ from the transhuman. Transhumanism still has a very solid core of anthropocentrism. Posthuman looks to the fact that, say with technology, the unpredictable nature of complex dynamics implies that subjectivity is emergent rather than given. In other words, the human person that is now extended through technological means is part of a wider system, so that subjectivity is rather distributed rather than located solely in consciousness. So as Catherine Hales in her fabulous book, How We Became Posthuman, writes, in the posthuman, there are no essential differences or absolute demarcations between bodily existence and computer simulation, cybernetic mechanism and biological organism, robot technology and human goals. By no essential differences, she's saying that we are not just autonomous subjects who use these things as a tool, rather in a cybernetic fashion, these tools are reshaping us. So the posthuman, we might say, decenters the rational human insofar as mind is not located only or solely within the subject itself, that there's a mind extension insofar as the person is now part of a network of information. So Bruno Latour's philosophy of the actor network theory is important here. Agency now circulates between the various actors, which include the technologies, right? So it's a way of looking at the tools that were created as not simply tools, but that are interactive agents. So we affect them, they affect us. And therefore, rather than seeing the human person as the autonomous subject in control, we are, in a sense, more like nodes within these complex systems of information. And therefore, human decision-making and our behavior is part of emergent systems. We still do make the decisions that affect the systems, but the systems also affect our decision-making. So this term new materialism, so all of this to get to the new materialisms, because I hope what you'll appreciate is that it's really with the rise of, first with the rise of the new science, and then with the rise of technology, we really began to awake within the last few decades of matter as more than mere matter. And therefore this term, the new materialisms, was coined by Manuel DeLanda and Rosi Braidotti in the second half of the 1990s, but we can find a lot of the components of new materialist thinking in the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. And, three maybe important points here are that mind is always material. And that, again, is an insight that's very consonant with what we've learned from quantum physics. Matter is something, therefore, of the mind. So mind and matter take on a much more integrative relationship. But nature and culture are also now more integrally related. There is no boundedness to nature versus culture. Rather, it is always nature-culture, looking at these phenomenon as interactive systems. Gilles Deleuze is a very interesting thinker whose insights will be in some ways compatible with Teilhard de Chardin. In his view, the subject is a folding in of external influences and a simultaneous unfolding outwards of effects. So his notion of personhood is interior, exterior, subject and object, individual, social, and symbolic, all kind of co-constitutive of one another instead of something that's predetermined, going back to that Enlightenment subject. So Deleuze has done some serious rethinking of matter. And I think, what we can say about the new materialisms on the whole is precisely this point. Matter is a transformative force in itself. And even Felix Guattari, in his notion of transversality, here he's saying that matter has its own type of agency. And therefore, material agency cuts across or intersects the dual oppositions in an immanent way. And putting this in a shorthand way, transversality or the new materialism is really dispelling binaries, the binaries that we have been so immersed in for centuries. So what we're saying here is materiality is taken to be something more than mere matter. And this is why I'm going to come back to this point. I don't think we can just talk about this in terms of naturalism, quite honestly. That word, in terms of the philosophies today, is not really used very much because, well, I'll get back to that point. What I want to see here is with the new materialisms, there is an excess force. This is a really interesting point from Deleuze, a vitality, a relationality, or a difference that renders matter active, self-creative, productive, unpredictable. One, you might think that Teilhard de Chardin might have written that statement. Again, we can consider anew the location and nature of capacities for agency. So, I just want to note two things here. One, if we awaken up to the fact that matter matters, we can also wake up to the fact that matter has the power of agency. So this turn to matter, and that's really what the new materialisms are about. We're turning, rather than mind and matter, or the human person who has, a material body, but an immaterial mind, that's yesterday. Now we are into a new materialist ontology, where it's not about entities, but relations, not about agency, but affects, intra-agency. So not about structures, but unstable assemblages, hybridity, complex systems, not about construction, but production, not about textualities, but matter itself. So these are significant shifts that are now beginning to be discussed more and more. Now, what's interesting about the new materialisms is that there's some of philosophies, process philosophies are beginning to kind of, be renewed. Going back to Deleuze and others, materiality, again, that's a repeat, that first statement again, but it's worth repeating, more than mere matter. There's something here that's vital, that's relational. So it's not just stuff. It's not just inert stuff. And Deleuze asks a really provocative question. What holds everything together? Great question, Giles, right? And I want you to keep this question in mind when we get to Teilhard, which we will soon. But he proposes arboreal and rhizomic connections. Rhizomes, are those interlocking connections, like, the roots of a mushroom thing, a mushroom bush or whatever. Arboreal or tree-like. So what do we have here? Well, we have a renewal of Henri Bergson's Élan Vital, Alfred Whitehead's Lure. And so there's something here that they're saying that accounts for this vitality and dynamism of matter. And therefore it impels us to consider even matter as having its own agency. And here on that note, we'd have to look to the work of Karen Barad, her fascinating book on meeting the universe halfway, where she, as a physicist following the school of Niels Bohr, began to realize that matter itself, and if you really have to read her book to get the full argument here, but you know, she takes the work of Niels Bohr, the physics of Bohr, and she translates that into a philosophical key. And, you know, she comes out with this term, agential realism, that matter itself feels, converses, desires, yearns, and remembers. And she says all designated things are constantly exchanging and diffracting, influencing and working inseparably. So in Barad's view, matter has its own modes of self-transformation, self-organization, and directedness, and therefore is no longer simply passive or inert. Now, what's interesting for Barad is that agency does not belong to the human alone. Rather, the human agency is impacted by material agency and vice versa. So the human person is relocated within a natural environment whose material forces manifest certain agentic capacities. Now that's very interesting. It's a really insightful way of looking at a kind of agential mutuality within a material complexity in which the human is embedded. So the matter is recognized as indeterminate, constantly forming and reforming in unexpected ways. So in Barad's view, what is pre-existing is relations. This is right out of quantum physics, right? What is pre-existing is relations from which relata, that's which relates, emerge. In other words, something doesn't not first exist and then relate, rather relationships are formative of existence. This is Teilhard de Chardin as well. In Barad's view, agency is not a center of action, but a center of relationship. Agency is not something one has, but what one is. Therefore, agency is mutual, it's bilateral, and therefore it's consistent with the operations of a complex dynamical system. Her work is fascinating, and I'll just take the last 2 points here, looking at the time. What she says is, we are the world in its ongoing changes and reconfigurations and dynamics, and the world takes shape through our action. So in her view, she has a whole thing on epistemology and beingness, metaphysics, where she says knowing and being are mutually related. We know because we are of the world, and we are part of the world in its differential becoming. This is a much more dynamic, process-oriented type of ontology and epistemology. So the posthuman subject now is materially embedded, multi-layered, a nomadic entity. And this word nomadic is brought to us by Rosi Braidotti, our third posthuman thinker, in which the human is constantly immersed in interrelations, including non-human agents. So we are in this dynamic process of always ceasing to be as we're in the process of becoming. It's a being and becoming. So I just wanted to introduce you to Braidotti in case you're not familiar with her, a very fascinating thinker, a student of Gilles Deleuze and Guattari, mostly Deleuze, where she says the nomadic is in perpetual becoming. We are the nomadics, right? So instead of talking about subjects, Braidotti talks about nomadic subjects or just nomadics. In other words, we're in this constant interplay between present and the present as becoming something more, and therefore we're in this rhythm of subject formation. So she repositions subjectivity, and she's looking at this nomadic subjectivity now within social, political, ecological complexities. And, you know, again, the third point here, basically she's saying the post-human requires a new ecology, a new way of understanding what it means to be personhood within the complexities of the milieu in which we're embedded, including our social, political, ethical, and aesthetic dimensions. So rather than looking at vertical lines of power, we look at transversal lines of what she calls autopoetic subjectivity, insofar as, since we're part of systems, those systems are constantly undergoing, you might say, renewal as they interact with the larger environment. So you might say these are the components of her nomadic subjectivity of posthumanism or posthuman life. And I might call it the nomadic subject as complex life system. So we're autopoetic insofar as we're in this dynamic flux of engagement. Interestingly, Braidotti, like Deleuze, thinks that the vital, the elan vital, there's a dynamic impulse here that really warrants a new type of, or resurgence of, monistic philosophy. And of course, she also sees mind as part of the materiality itself, and therefore calls for an expanded relational self. So funny enough, a number of the posthumans are trying to kind of move back toward a pantheism. Even Mary Jane Rubenstein's work on pantheologies. So they're trying to, in a sense, find a new meaning in this this interrelated posthuman person in this nature culture continuum. So Braidotti calls for return to Spinoza's monism. Matter is one driven by a desire for self-expression and ontologically free. Some of you may be familiar with Jane Bennett's work on vibrant matter, where again, this self, so-called self, is this movable assemblage within this common life space in which we never really master anything, but we inhabit things, we cross over in types of communities. And it's sort of a dynamic interrelationality. We're constantly we're immersed in networks of human, non-human relationships. And those non-humans are animal, vegetable, technological. So basically, embedded, relational, affective, and material describes the posthuman. And the only thing I want to again point out here is this is a better picture of rhizomatics or rhizomes, right? We're shifting, right? We're shifting our thinking from binaries to rhizomes or rhizomatics. And this, why this is this important? Because our binaries of sex or gender or nature or culture, these are shifting, right? So a number of people today in terms of speaking about nomadic subjectivity or posthumanities, are looking at post-gendering, right? And so post even racializing. So we're looking at a new type of personhood within a realm of complexity, so that Braidotti says we even need a new type of post-human knowledge, which might be a type of post-humanities. So if you're in the humanities, that might become obsolete. She even calls for a new type of politics. Post-human societies, she says, require micropolitics, sort of local interaction, transversal politics. So I see, there's a number of things here. I think I'm going to move on a little bit. But maybe, for our purposes, and you can see, although a lot of this discussion sounds like we've moved away from technology, all of this, and I want you to keep this in mind, we haven't lost sight of transhumanism and technology. Actually, what posthumanists do is they reinsert technology within a much more complex framework of relationships. So post-anthropocentrism is a shift of consciousness towards a planetary geocentric perspective. It's reconfiguring the relationship of our complex habitat, which we used to call nature. And I want to emphasize that because I would be concerned about using that word nature as if it's still current. Rather, we're looking at a new configuration of technology, personhood, and materialism. So, on that note, and I won't belabor the point, but I know that IRAS has its conference next year on naturalism. But again, this idea that we can just reduce everything to nature is ambivalent, right? Because nature, first of all, that word nature is such a umbrella term that it's not, it's ambiguous at best. But even more so, naturalism still carries with it, it conjures up binary relationships. And of course, religion is problematic for naturalists. The new materialisms opens up this space just like an open system would, right? It's non-equilibrium at best, right? There's a vital force in matter, which is intra-agential, which is dynamic and relational. And so that brings me to my final segment on Teilhard de Chardin, or I should give him the full name of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who I think is really a forerunner of the new materialisms. His essay on the heart of matter is very, very consonant to what the new materialists are talking about. But he wrote this essay back in, let me see, I'm looking at it right here. Let me just get the date because it's really amazing, right? 1919. 1919, he writes The Heart of Matter, where he says, I could never feel at home unless immersed in an ocean of matter. And so right here, I want to say that Teilhard was not in any way anthropocentric, just the opposite. He is an early new materialist who takes seriously Big Bang cosmology and what we were learning about the new contours of space-time. As Einstein's general relativity tells us, matter tells space how to curve, and curved space tells matter how to move. And therefore, we have this space-time matter continuum unfolding. And that's what Teilhard really recognized, that there, and he tells us in his essay on the heart of matter, he was attracted to rocks and iron, something that was hard and substantive, matter, the hardness of matter. And he realized that, he said, there grew in me a presence. Like, what was this hardness of matter and what drew him to it? He said, the consciousness of a deep running ontological total current, which embraced the whole universe in which I moved, was what he was experiencing in this matter. So he speaks of the cult of matter and the cult of life and the cult of energy. Matter, life, energy, the very same aspects that the new materialists are now raising up. Teilhard adds also to these three cults, he adds language of presence, of wholeness, of plenitude. Again, Deleuze's question, what holds the whole together, right? What Teilhard contributes is, I think, a much greater emphasis on movement, right? Not a cosmos, he realizes, but a cosmogenesis, a cosmos that is coming to be. And therefore, what Teilhard recognizes at the heart of matter is something, the matter of matter, so to speak, is not matter, but spirit. So he speaks of the spiritualization of matter. And a lot of people can take that out of context and think he's talking about matter and spirit. But spirit is not opposite to tangible matter in Teilhard's view. It is the heart of it. And so, excuse me, he begins to look at, well, what is the vitality of matter itself? And he is very influenced by Henri Bergson's Élan Vital and begins to, in a sense, reflect on this Élan Vital in terms of his own faith as a Catholic, as a Christian, and speaks of omega, right? This omega, this Élan Vital, this principle of aliveness, of wholeness that's within matter, right? That is irresistible, that is, at the heart of matter, and yet cannot be, in a sense, worn down by, as matter wears down. So this omega has this quality to it that is not only sustaining the material life, but in some ways seems to be empowering it towards more matter spirit. So Teilhard puts this whole thing into the framework of evolution. And this is his, I think, significant contribution to the new materialisms, which is what I find lacking sometimes in the discussions on the new materialisms. We kind of lose sight that this is not only an organic process of interlocking life, but it is a dynamic process. It is unfolding. In other words, that which is becoming in its interrelatedness is not fully realized, right? It's oriented toward the future. So Teilhard coins the term hyperphysics, that the whole is in movement, and it's in movement toward more being. And borrowing from Karen Barad, I think this term would be very appropriate to Teilhard, that what is in movement is a space-time mattering, right? It's kind of what cannot be separated into parts. That matter is this ongoing differentiating of world, and therefore matter performatively materializing time and space rather than unfolding within them. That is really significant, and it's a significant shift to how we have thought about matter, space, and time. What Teilhard recognized way before the new materialists is that we have to change our geometry. What comes first is not being, but union. And he says, a consciousness of being means a consciousness of union in movement. So he had his finger on the pulse of matter, again, before our philosophers were born. He adds to this, and this is interesting, and it's very appropriate for Teilhard. He says there's an energy that's an irresistible energy, and it withstands itself even as matter breaks down, even as there's entropy in the universe. And he calls this the energy of love. Love because it's an energy of attraction, and yet as it attracts, there's a transcendence, right? There's a growth in consciousness. So in some ways, Teilhard's energy of love might, in a sense, speak to Deleuze's notion of an arboreal and rhizomatic connections within nature, which probably needs more work to spell out, but it's rather interesting. So what Teilhard sees is that this whole network of interlocking and interrelated materiality is the unfolding of consciousness, right? Matter is the matrix of consciousness, and consciousness born of matter is always advancing towards some type of ultra-human, right? Always more than human, because it's always more being. And he speaks of a second species of spirit emerging transversely on the horizon, right? Because as we are advancing, there's a new type of synthesis going on. We're moving towards greater wholeness, to put this in shorthand terminology. So he says what accounts for the, he doesn't say this, but it's true of Teilhard, what accounts for the human mind is active in the universe. And of course, he says, blessed are you, mighty matter, irresistible march of evolution, reality ever newborn. You who by constantly shattering our mental categories, wow, matter shatters our mental categories, forces us to go even further and further in our pursuit of the truth. So what does this mean for Teilhard? Well, putting this together, God Omega is the infinite source and depth of matter. So Omega is that elan vital, and Teilhard takes that now in terms of his faith, in terms of, you might say, a personal dimension to materiality itself. God as that depth, as that breadth, as that horizon of matter, right? So there's something that's taking form in matter. That's matter, but even more than matter. That's holding it together and moving it towards greater wholeness. And of course, he will merge this idea of new materialisms with Christianity and see the whole of this evolutionary paradigm of increasing materiality and spirit in terms of the emergence of Christ. So what he says is cosmogenesis is from the point of faith, Christogenesis. And he speaks of a third nature of Christ, where Christ is not related just or juridically, but organically to the whole cosmos. Christ has a third nature in the cosmos. Christ is the evolver, meaning that divine presence, divine love, incarnate, is moving this whole kit and caboodle towards something more. So Teilhard writes in his hymn to Matter that a being was taking form in the totality of space. He's not saying that Christ takes place in evolution. He's saying the whole of evolution is the becoming of the Christ or the Christic. A being with the attractive power of a soul, palpable like a body, vast as the sky. A being which mingled with things yet remained distinct from them. A being of a higher order than the substance of things with which it was adorned, yet taking shape within them. The rising sun was being born in the heart of the world. God was shining forth from the summit of that world of matter, whose waves were carrying up to him the worlds of spirit. It's very poetic. And, a lot of people could easily misread this passage in some kind of type of French devotionalism, I guess. But what Teilhard is really getting at is really taking what the new materialists and the posthuman thinkers are trying to get at, but you might say, contributes to that now, a new place of religion. And that's really, it's hard to get our heads around, but, he sees that we need to get beyond and move beyond the religions of the past. They don't work anymore. And to try to keep forging them onto the new materiality story isn't going to work either. And he says, in the future, the only religion possible is the one which will teach us to recognize, love, and serve with passion the universe of which we form a part, right? It's not an escape from the material world. The new religion of the earth is an embrace of materiality itself in its social spheres, its political spheres, its ecological spheres, its animal life, its vegetable life, its rock life. So he says, God has become too small to nourish in us the desire to go on living on a higher plane. That is for sure. Right now we know that the cosmos is a dynamic process of cosmogenesis, and therefore, Teilhard wrote, we need to modify the whole structure, not only of our thoughts, but of our beliefs, right? So he would say, look, the whole thing of science and religion maybe needs to be ditched for a whole new, maybe language of how to talk about these two areas. What he sees, what is this omega in evolution about? I can't tell you how many people have really misread Teilhard on the omega principle. So many people asking, do we arrive at an omega point? Like it's a train station of some sort, or the omega is something that seems absorptive, like an absorbed type of monism. The whole thing is misguided. What Teilhard sees is that divinity is coming to birth at the heart of materiality. He takes the incarnation and he takes that seriously as what this material universe is about. So the whole of evolution, therefore, becomes, you might say, I don't use the Hegelian idea of the autobiography of God, but there's a concept of divine becoming. Through ongoing incarnation, God rises up through consciousness and is completed by humankind in directed evolution. This is not original to Teilhard. Jakob Boehm, Hegel, Schelling, and Jung all spoke of theogenesis. Teilhard, however, has, I think, a much more holistic view of divinity and materiality in this theogenic process. He writes in his Heart of Matter, as God metamorphized the world from the depths of matter to the peaks of spirit, so the world must inevitably, and to the same degree, endomorphize God. Whitehead said something very similar. As a direct consequence of the unitive process by which God is revealed to us, God in some way transforms God's self as God incorporates us. It is not a matter of simply seeing God. We have to disclose God ever more fully. Now, here on this note, is where, if we understand Teilhard in light of posthumanism, where posthumanism would make a healthy break from transhumanism. Transhumanists want to be God. If we read, I mean, Kurzweil speaks a lot about, God and divinity, but they have a very narrow understanding here of theosis or divinization. Teilhard says all around us and within our own selves, God is in process of changing as a result of God's magnetic power in our own thought. This is a God of process, a God of becoming. God and the world are in the process of becoming something more together because the universe is grounded in this personal center of Omega, in this Elan Vital, in this dynamic energy of love, we can say. God comes to birth in the heart of matter when consciousness gives way to the power of love. So it's an ongoing incarnation. And therefore, materiality and the beauty of a dynamic materiality is there's something even more dynamic at the heart of it. God is, in a sense, rising up and being completed in directed evolution. And that's, again, alarming to us because even atheists have really old understandings of God. And that's been a lot of the problem, in my view. What Teilhard says is, I see in the world a mysterious product of completion and fulfillment for the absolute being. Plenitude, presence is not just about matter alone. It is about it is about Omegan matter. It's about divinity matter. It's about this cosmotheandric matter. So it's no longer participated being, like in the Thomistic sense, like God is being itself in which we participate, Teilhard says, but it's participated being of pleromization and convergence. And those are two words I think that we need to really break open. Pleromization, something is becoming more full in and through this process of materialism, mind and spirit. So he says it is the effect no longer of creative causality, but of creative union. And so, Teilhard in 1919 tried to move out of the straitjackets, you might say, of a scholastic metaphysical paradigm into an evolutionary understanding of God and world. But as we know, it didn't really take hold. But we're still working on that. I'm going to skip this because all I wanted to say here is that Hales's insight on the posthuman as expansive of the cognitive system it inhabits is very consonant with Teilhard's noosphere, right? So Teilhard posits, that in evolution, as we, in a sense, become more, as we advance in knowledge, as we advance in consciousness, as we advance in our relationships, right? What we are also advances by expansion. It's not a matter of leaving the body behind, but of extending what we are through new material ways. In Hales's view, that would be impossible without an electronic prosthesis. Teilhard would agree. In fact, he would see that right now we're in a new sphere, right? We are extended and expanded in a way that would have been impossible in 1960. So the only thing that I would add here to Teilhard is that he places a significant emphasis on the role of mysticism. And here I use the word contemplation. In other words, there's an inner depth to human personhood that, if awakened, prayer, meditation, centering, if we come in touch with that Omega within us, we are awakened to, you might say, what we are called to be around us. And so here's my final slide. No, I have one more slide. Teilhard uses this language of two words he uses here, the Christic and the terrestrian. Now, the Christic is, it detracts us because we're thinking, oh, that sounds so Christian, but it's really not quite what he has in mind. The Christic is that cosmotheandric wholeness. Cosmos, human subjectivity, materialism's divinity, in a sense, and that's why I have this image here. They, excuse me, they become ever the more interrelated as we continue this process of evolution through technology in the noosphere, through, you might say, action, political, social action, co-creative union, as materiality affects subjectivity, subjectivity affects materiality. But what Teilhard's saying is that we move into a sense of more beingness through greater consciousness, through what binds us together, in his view, the energies of love. So in his view, one who lives by the life of the whole is awakened to divine life at the heart of matter. We should be talking about pleroma and presence rather than just science and religion. We need to, in a sense, shift our language and our thought patterns if we're going to talk about personhood in the 21st century, that we are subject. This is Teilhard's language, by the way. I should have put quotes around it. The human person must be subject to the same development as every other species of the world. One must coalesce into physical relationships and groupings of a higher order and organicity of collective magnitude. This is Haraway, this is Braidotti, this is Hales. What we're saying and what they have said is technology now has enhanced this higher order of organicity. But as Teilhard said, technology can go either way, right? We do have to shape its social, ethical use and development. But in Teilhard's view, if we can develop the noosphere with technology in a way that deepens what we are, then we must develop also the sixth sense, that traversal sense of spirit, that we're becoming something more together than we are individually. A hyper-personalization that, in a sense, is being driven by the energies of love. So Teilhard he is teleological. He has a sense of the pattern of evolution towards greater personalization. By that, he means a kind of transhuman. In other words, the whole cosmos is becoming more and more personalized, in the sense the way that we can now contact one another across the globe with the internet. And what he adds to this, at the heart of it, it is God who is rising up, that divine light that has been empowering it, to rising up into greater levels of consciousness, hopefully greater relationships of love, because God, for Teilhard, is our future. That is the end of my slides. And so I guess I should turn this over now to Ron or to whoever else might have.
Thank you so thank you so much, Ilia. You've given us so much to think about here. Thank you so much. You'll stay right where you are because we're going to go quickly to Jack Haught. John Haught is the distinguished research professor at the University of Georgetown, specializing in Catholic systematic theology, in particular, a wide range of science and religion issues, but cosmology, evolutionary biology, and so forth. A real pillar of the science and religion conversations over the past 40 years. Widely used books, used as textbooks and to guide other scholars in the field. Science and Faith, A New Introduction, 2012. Well, I won't list them all, but they include titles addressing the new atheists, something that popped up earlier in the conversation here. So we're going to go to John Haught, and he's going to make a few comments. Then we'll go back to Ilia, and she is going to reply. But let me call everybody's attention to the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. Type your questions in, and we will get to them, we hope, before the end of tonight's program. We'll probably go 5-10 minutes over, but type your questions in and we'll get them queued up as quickly as we can. So Jack, let's go to you next. Thanks.
Okay, am I visible? Thank you very much, Ron, for that generous introduction. And thank you, Ilia, once again for the opportunity to engage with you as I've done over the years and so many times in so many ways on issues. And I'm especially grateful for this presentation because it has introduced this whole very interesting phenomenon of the so-called new materialism. And it leaves me, and I'm sure many other people, with the question, and it's really only one question, but I'll have to unfold it in many different ways. And that's the question of why keep the word materialism as the label for this movement when it seems to me that vitalism or organicism or romanticism or something else would be just as appropriate a title. And I wanted to ask you whether I'm right in suspecting that they want to hold on to the word materialism because they want at all costs to avoid what they would consider to be the superstition of a transcendent element to reality. And in asking that question, I need to ask whether the new materialism is fully distinguishable from the old materialism. Granted, it is in many ways. For example, the new materialism wants to distribute subjectivity all over reality rather than to confine it in our own craniums and then separating us in a privileged way from the rest of the universe. So what I want to do is to bring in a cosmic dimension here because I didn't hear the word cosmos mentioned in the new materialist literature, or at least very seldom. And above all, what is missing is something that's absolutely vital to the Teilhardian view of things, and that's the notion of the future, that the cosmos is something that in which the future is arriving and doing very interesting things, including awakening subjectivity. Now, to compare the new materialism with the old materialism, the old materialism, subjectivity, which is a major topic for the new materialism, is completely absent from its map of the universe. It's a world, the materialist world of the old materialism is a world without subjects. In fact, subjects do not even really exist, but only objects do. And of course, this has been ethically suspect because it's hard to affirm the dignity of persons and other living subjects if subjectivity, which we attribute to them, is not really real. It's also a world, the world of the old materialism is a world without freedom. It's a world in which subjects do not exist, but only objects as part of the matter-energy continuum. Ironically, however, the old materialism was still crypto-dualistic in its placing the mind of the scientist in some made-up semi-Platonic timeless world supposedly existing outside of the objective world that allows the scientist to therefore be detached in such a way as to facilitate epistemologically the ideal of objectivity. And it's epistemologically suspect, the old materialism, because it can't answer the question, how can we justify trust in our minds, which we have to have if we're going to do science and any other intellectual pursuit, if minds don't really exist? So there are a lot of problems there. And so when I wonder, when I'm asking you, is does the new materialism deal effectively with these defects that they point out as essential to the definition of the old materialism? The new materialism rightly seeks to overcome dualism and Cartesianism, and it tries to distribute subjectivity throughout nature to remove the sense of human privilege and separatism. And it also emphasizes the theme of relationality, which is, as you pointed out, is a very Whiteheadian organismic theme, not something you associate with materialism. And the new materialism rightly seeks to address the ethical and ecological drawbacks of the old materialism, since the old materialism does not give us a basis for evaluating living beings above non-living beings. So I have really two questions then. Does the softer materialism of the new materialism allow for the uniqueness of the human subject, or does the human subject get lost in this distribution of subjectivity throughout the cosmos, throughout the natural world? And secondly, can the new materialism allow for what Teilhard would want to allow for, and that subjectivity is the universe in the act of awakening to the future? Back to the first question. Human subjectivity, it seems to me, is unique in that it does not just experience the world like other subjects do, and perhaps more intensely than these, but human subjectivity unfolds in differentiated acts, which you don't find in other forms of subjectivity. It seeks understanding, and it seeks truth, and it seeks rightness. In other words, it doesn't just attend to the world, it also has to be intelligent about it, to seek intelligibility in it. And after it finds intelligibility, another question arises in human subjectivity: is my understanding correct understanding? And what should I do with my life on the basis of my understanding? So human subjectivity is driven, as Bernard Lonergan, Teilhard's fellow Jesuit, has written so eloquently, human minds are driven by or guided by four imperatives that you don't find distributed in subjectivity of other sorts. And that's the imperative to be attentive, that is, to be open to the world, but also the imperative to be intelligent. And not only to be intelligent, but to be reasonable and critical, and then also to be responsible. And it's those four transcendental imperatives that define human subjectivity. And so what I would want to ask of you and the new materialists is what kind of universe, if there's no separation between subjectivity and the cosmos, what does it tell us about the universe that it is housing or giving a home to this really rich form of subjectivity, intelligent subjectivity, as Lonergan calls it? I would want to agree with the new materialist that we have to make mind completely at home in the universe, something that the old materialists could not do because their universe was essentially mindless. But have the new materialists thought out what kind of universe, how rich a universe it must be that it can, first of all, give rise to or awaken to this kind of intelligent subjectivity? What kind of universe does that imply? And what does that imply also about the future of the universe? Because it seems to me that a watered down notion of subjectivity, which is what I see in the new materialism, as well as in a lot of contemporary philosophy, a watered down notion of subjectivity, one that's not enriched like the Lonerganian view that I just described, it's likely to give us a watered down universe. Since there's no separation between subjectivity and the cosmos, does the new materialism have an adequately rich understanding of subjectivity to make its universe proportionately rich? What I would suggest, and I'm raising this more as a question, wouldn't it be possible to integrate the new materialism into contemporary science and cosmology and other disciplines if they would come to see the universe the way Teilhard did, as the story of an awakening? To see the universe as a drama of awakening would also, it seems to me, allow for a smoother integration and welcoming of the information sciences, of artificial intelligence, and the other technologies that you've talked about this evening as part of an awakening universe? Can't we see these things as not so monstrous and forbidding if we could connect them to the drama that's been going on for billions of years, a drama of awakening? And wouldn't this also provide norms for human activity as well, as I think Teilhard also suggests, that the good life, the good human life, given this understanding of an awakening universe that's not separate from subjectivity, wouldn't this universe be hospitable to these new developments in technology if we could see all of this as something that's happening to the universe, so that we could transpose in a way, and I think Teilhard does this, subjectivity and consciousness from our own human isolated thinking minds, res cogitans, and distribute this theme of awakening throughout the universe. And that would allow for degrees of subjectivity, some of which, even now, since the universe is just now getting started, some of these degrees of subjectivity we can barely anticipate at the moment. But for the sake of their eventually existing, we have to be careful not to dismiss technology and informational technologies, and maybe even cyborgs would not seem as monstrous to us as they might otherwise do. And my final question, of course, and I don't want to go into this, but I think you touched on it in your discussion of Teilhard. If we have an awakening universe, it begs the question, awakening to what? And by asking that question, I think, or I would wonder whether we don't perhaps therefore have the fortunate outcome of having a much more open universe than we've had for the last 4 centuries. Just a few questions. If you could answer them in 2 or 3 words, Ilia, that would be fine.
Oh, that's great, Jack. Yeah, I mean, I hope I can come back here. You raise some really interesting points. You have a number of questions, Jack, by the way. So let me see. Let me see if I can address them. I tried to jot them down a little bit. Why keep the word materialism was your first question. To avoid, is it trying to avoid superstition to a transcendent reality? No, I don't think so. I think my reading of the New Materialist is precisely because there is a desire to recognize that matter is not just inert stuff. Like we have assumed, I think, materiality just sort of as a substrate of, subjectivity. We have bodies rather than being embodied. And so I think the New Materialism wants to, and why it's the same reason why it doesn't use the word naturalism, right? Anything that might abstract matter or kind of reduce matter to something that's secondary, I think is to be, they're trying to avoid here saying, no, matter really matters. Because matter is more than just mere stuff, right? It's just not inert stuff. So given that, your questions on the New Materialism allowing for the uniqueness of the human subject, or is there a loss of subjectivity? I understand what you are asking. I don't think, let me just say, as I understand the New Materialisms, it's not sacrificing anything of human subjectivity. It is repositioning human subjectivity within a matrix of relationships. In other words, I think the old notion of the human person as autonomous subject was over and against, in some ways, the material world, right? The person of power, the person of knowledge, the one who made the decision maker. It's not that we don't have power or knowledge. It's how now understanding ourselves now within the matrix of relationships repositions knowledge and power. To say that it is knowledge and power do not belong to the human person alone, that the human person is part of a network of relationships and therefore is affected by those relationships, even as the human person affects those relationships. So, we're still attentive, we're still intelligent, we still, use, our insights, our intellectual ideas, our experiences, and we still reflect on those to make responsible decisions. What new materialism adds to that is that the decisions we make in terms of, our actions in the world are also affected by the material world itself. So there's this idea that, every human, both human thought and human action are limited precisely because we do not live in a kind of autonomous space with matter around us. We live as material beings within a material world. So I understand your concern. It's a good one, but I would say we have to rethink subjectivity now within a much broader network of constitutive relationships. And in that respect, I think, can the new materialism allow for subjectivity in the universe? Now, you raised two important points, and that is, and I think you're absolutely right, I think the new materialists do not pay sufficient attention to the kind of universe that gives rise to human subjectivity, and in using your language, Jack, the awakening to what the universe is becoming. I think there's a lot of room here for some more books, Jack, but all I'm saying is that this is a fairly new field of inquiry. And, I think people are always writing out of their own immediate concerns. And of course, from women, it has been the concern of power and the concern of freedom. And so, I think that is their hermeneutic, not to, in a sense, avoid the universe question, but I do, even if I read Deleuze and others, I do sometimes get a sense of a static presence when I lose sight sometimes with the materialist that this is a process. So there is a becoming, and therefore I think you rightly ask in terms of the language of cosmos, which is not language that the new materialists use, quite honestly, a lot in their writings. There was another, yes, are they trying to avoid the transcendent, or is there, are they trying to frame things so that we can not have to invoke the name of God or religion? Now, this is an interesting thing, because if you read Braidotti, for example, she's like, no, I don't want to invoke, I'm not invoking any type of divinity here. But I'm all for Spinoza's God, which I think is quite rightly belongs to new materialism. So I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Or, Deleuze, like, we need a type of monism. So what I find with the new materialisms, there's this kind of leaning toward divinity. There's something here that they can't quite, they can't reduce it to just cells interacting, right? They're not, in a sense, like the naturalists sometimes who, not that I'm saying naturalists reduce things, they don't. But the new materialists do want to open a door to something other, an otherness, if I could just use that broad language, at the heart of matter. And so, this notion of Spinoza's God, God is nature idea. But I have to tell you that I think even Spinoza's God is getting short-shrifted a little bit here. I think Spinoza's God may be a little bit closer to Teilhard's God than it is to a kind of just, Einstein's God, where it's all laws and forces and attractions. So, and even though Einstein likes Spinoza, I get it. So I do think, let me just say this way, I think you're raising some excellent points, and I do think there's more work to be done here. But what I do think the new materialists contribute right now is a repositioning of human subjectivity within the network of deep relationality. And this is really important in terms of ecology, in terms of resituating the political sphere and the social sphere, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of the many things that we are facing right now in our milieu. However, I think, and here's why I do think Teilhard has something very vital to offer to this conversation. I think if we could reposition the role of religion within the matrix of relationships and the place of God, or if that language of God is disconcerting to people, perhaps they might find other language to replace it. I'm not sure. Teilhard would not, he used the language of God. All of this to say is that I think we're sitting on a precipice, a cusp right now, a sort of two paths are diverging in the cosmos. And, if we choose the right path, we might have a sustainable future. But I think, I don't think we're losing anything of subjectivity. I have to really be honest with the new materialisms. I think we are on the cusp of a renewed subjectivity that can be much richer than what we have had for the last few centuries, I might say. I see glimpses of this actually in Gen Z, in Gen X and Gen Z, young generations. They are, in a sense, they're already posthuman by the way they are wired to think across lines, transversal lines of interconnectivity in terms of politics, in terms of the poor, in terms of the environment. However, I think what's missing from the piece is that, as you point out, the notion of cosmos itself oriented toward the future. What are we, as we awaken to deep connectivity, what is that awakening to in terms of the whole? Where are we going together? And so I would just say great questions. I don't know if I answered any of them really, but what kind of universe gives rise to intelligent subjectivity? Yeah, I mean, again, I think epistemology, metaphysics, human subjectivity, and human becoming right now are all being revisited. What I think maybe my last point here, and then we can open it up for some discussion, maybe the one healthy note of the new materialisms and posthumanism is that the whole thing is not shriveled down to human enhancement, as we sometimes see with transhumanists. Not all transhumanism. And I might just say that transhumanism and posthumanism are, they are connected. They're not radically different things. But some radical transhumanists see human exceptionalism, right? Human enhancement as superhumanness, almost to the point sometimes of either avoiding or just ignoring the larger spheres of deep connectivity, which I find very problematic. So on that note, maybe I'll just stop and maybe we can just open it up for other questions.
Yes, and unfortunately, time has gotten away from us. I say unfortunately because this has been absolutely fascinating conversation. Professor Jack Haught moments ago posing some questions, brilliantly stated, and really an able response from our primary speaker tonight, Professor Ilia Delio. So I'm going to try to squeeze in one little question if I can here. It's a certain kind of anxiety. Let's see, make sure we're on there. Okay. It has to do with the anxiety of, it's kind of Bill Joy stated it a long time ago with the essay, why the future doesn't need us. And it's in reference to cyborgs and things like that. Why do we think the technologies of the future will be particularly kind to human beings? Let me reposition that in reference to AI and ask Ilia, is it legitimate in your view to think that the AI, the artificial intelligence of the future, will want to have mere human beings around, or recast that as a deeper, more Teilhardian kind of question? If Teilhard is right, are human beings ultimately passé?
Yeah, so thanks, Ron. So, again, I find the question as it's posed binary. So it's AI or human. And that's precisely where posthumanism, Catherine Hales would say, it's neither one nor the other. But I know some transhumanists see along Bill Joy's, thing that we're going to be supplanted by artificial intelligence. When in fact, what Hales is saying, no, we're creating these entities, right? We're creating robots, we create AI, and we're in a sense merging with it. So in terms of a cybernetic loop, we're creating it and it is creating us. Will it eventually replace us? Not insofar as we are becoming something new with it. So the question is not so much humans, robots, but what's the third entity? What is the in between that's merging or converging with this noospheric type of personhood? So that's where I am concerned sometimes, because there's a lot of discussion on questions like this in transhumanism, right? And I think those questions, they kind of thwart our thinking away from a convergence or a complexification of personhood in and through technology. Maybe that's a better way to state it. That's what Hale sought. She sought this is a complexifying process of emergent subjectivity, where we're not replaced per se. We are, in a sense, we're reformed through it. So I do not see that, eventually we are going to have robots. They're already here. That's not a big deal for me, but we're still here as well. And I think it's a question of how to become aware of what we're creating, how we're merging it, and what we are becoming in and through that convergence with our technologies. And that's where I do think we need ethics. We need other conversation partners in this discussion, right? I don't think we can just have, the computer people telling us, like a Ray Kurzweil saying, we built super intelligent AI, and now we're going to go download our brains. It's just not. We don't. So again, posthumanism saying binaries don't work anymore. That's what they're saying, philosophically, that even the matter itself that we're creating in, the tools or whatever you want to call them, they're impacting us. That's the philosophical shift here. And that's what I don't see enough of in the transhumanist discussions.
Yeah. Well, that is very helpful, very insightful. Thank you so much. Ilia Delio has been our main guest tonight. Questions posed moments ago by Professor Jack Haught of Georgetown. Ilia, is good to see you again, my friend, and you have been very generous with us tonight in your insights and your precision and most of all, the gift of time. So thank you all. Thank you on behalf of all of us to you.